First season of Fargo, with its outstanding plotline and high-level acting, offers us some thought-provoking philosophical themes to analyze. The character of Lauren Malvo, with exceptional acting from Billy Bob Thornton, draws our attention to the essence of psychopathy and how the character tries to justify his actions by evolutionary approach. On the other hand, Lester Nygaard tells us a story about the danger of weakness and how unresolved resentment can be exploited in the right context. These two central characters serve a function of a binary opposition, which will be resolved by the third character, thus completing the psychological triangle that we witness throughout the show. Both characters share a property of lacking a necessary attribute for a healthy process of socialization. Nygaard on the one hand lacks the courage to address and recognize his inner trauma of being bullied, which piled up into a thick pile of resentment that can no longer be hidden under the rug. And on the other hand, we have Malvo, who lacks the humaneness to prevent him from exercising power into the most unethical ways possible. Therefore, we get Lester, who creates the necessary space, a sort of Heideggerian clearing for Malvo to act out his worldview, and Lauren in his turn provides the sparkle that was long awaited by the shadow of Nygaard. Let's start with Malvo then. His personae best illustrates the key feature of antisocial personality disorder, aka psychopathy. Psychopaths are known as cold-blooded evildoers committing all sorts of criminal acts. However, the psychiatric description of APD is the inability to conform to social norms. The brain region responsible for incorporating social norms into your cognitive apparatus is the prefrontal cortex, which is a novel upgrade in our evolutionary history. The frontal cortex undergoes what's known as pruning till you are 25 years old, which plays a crucial role in socialization. Interestingly, frontal cortex has topographical and functional connections with other cortical structures and subcortical layers of the brain, which plays a key role in emergence of what's known as a social brain, the latter being the biological function for what is generally called humaneness. Social brain, which is composed of functionally interconnected brain modules, is responsible for incorporating social norms, contributing to agreeableness, conscientiousness, affective and cognitive empathy, compassion, theory of mind, and sense of responsibility.
And in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, here we have one of the most perfect specimens of the human brain that has ever come to my attention at the university. And here the abnormal brain of the typical criminal. Observe, ladies and gentlemen, the scarcity of convolutions on the frontal lobe as compared to that of the normal brain, and the distinct degeneration of the middle frontal lobe. All of these degenerate characteristics check amazingly with the case history of the dead man before us, whose life was one of brutality, of violence and murder.
It is noteworthy that there is a general reduction in volume of frontal cortex in people diagnosed with APD. In order to reveal antisocial tendencies amongst younger generations, psychologists ask specific types of questions to school children. For example, if you ask children whether they would eat during the class if teacher allows them to do so, they would generally give a positive answer. Now, then they are asked whether they would punch the other kid if teacher allows them. That's when the internal moral compass activates, where children understand that there is a higher dimension of ethical rules that are not formal but have a different status, and they would generally refuse to kick the classmate. Here, the child who has a psychopathic tendency would generally accept the chance to engage in violence. As in the case of antisocial personality, there is no distinction between formal rules and the internal moral compass. In other words, if there is no external constraint or consequences, then as far as they are concerned, everything could be allowed. Now, the character of Lauren Malvo has rationalized his mental disorder into a quasi-intellectual worldview. In the beginning, Malvo creates a sort of hope that he will solve Lester's problems, although surely it turns out that he just exacerbates them by using Nygaard's inner traumas as a means to exercise his power. Probably Malvo's relation with Nygaard is best example of violating Kant's categorical imperative, which sounds like this. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. The hospital scene probably best describes one of the key features of psychopathy, namely the pathologically inflamed ego and sense of self-worth. If someone ever dares to insult or speak disparagingly to a psychopath, it would cause them to lose any possible self-restraint and commit violence by any means possible. Now let's see the real-life example.
I wish they would let me next door so I can spit in your fucking face.
You know I would absolutely kill you if you ever did something like that,
You
right?
could never kill me.
Oh, I bet you I could.
Malvo entering the condition of Nygaard doesn't represent an act of effective empathy, where one would vicariously feel other person's pain. Rather, it shows what is known as a cognitive empathy. This is something that psychopaths have at a very high level, which allows them to infer rather than experience other people's thoughts and mental processes. Interestingly, for Malvo, the most devastating and unbearable fact about Lester is the element of humiliation and the belittling of his dignity, as it is the case with the boy in the motel who gets humiliated by women at the counter. These types of scenarios create possibilities for Malvo to act out his beliefs about human affairs. Now, in the conversation between Malvo and Nygaard at the hospital reception, we have an archetypal scenario playing out, namely the Satan tempting the mortal human being. The tempting as such is only possible by exacerbating the existing tendencies within the human psyche. So for example, in Goethe's Faust, Mephistopheles is perfectly aware of protagonist's predisposition and craving towards unlimited power and knowledge, which therefore allows Devil to offer him the relevant means to get what he deeply desires. In this barter, Faust gets what he wants, which causes his moral downfall, and Mephistopheles, on the other hand, proves his point, namely that human beings are fallen and their ethical superstructure doesn't deserve any respect. Now, in case of Malvo, he wants to prove that humans are still apes, and that Nygaard's supposed moral disposition is just a cover-up for his weakness to admit the violent tendencies and the desire for revenge, which it definitely proves to be the case. Now, in order for us to give a proper assessment of Malvo's worldview, we need to give Devil its due and admit the more or less reasonable points that Lauren puts forward. Surely, Malvo, being an experienced psychopath, understands that Lester lives in a lie and a form of self-deception, as he never had the courage to look into the eyes of his inner demons.
We used to be gorillas. All we had is what we could take and defend. The truth is, you're more of a man today than you were yesterday.
How do you figure?
It's a red tide, Lester, this life of ours.
Malvo has the chance to demolish Lester's illusions about himself. This shows how dangerous it is when people forget or suppress their primordial unethical tendencies, and thus forgetting about the existence of their inner demons, thinking that we're fully emancipated from the horrors of nature. Now, the interesting aspect that draws our attention is Malvo's frequent remarks about the evolution of Homo sapiens, and generally how intellectually convenient can evolutionary theory be for someone who wants to rationally justify his violent actions. Let's see the real example of how a person diagnosed with APD described his experience and justification for doing so.
I was in high school biology when evolutionary theory was really laid out for us. Species develop new characteristics, new traits, and then those can actually eventually take over. And so I concluded that maybe I had reached a higher stage of humanity where I wasn't held back by emotions the way other people were. And so I came to regard all these little rules that people tell you to follow as kind of brainwashing me. Breaking into places and, breaking into the school or stealing things. I felt like I was stripping away these layers of rules that people had been imposing on me my entire life, and it was an amazing feeling. And if I really wanted to sort of be free of everything I'd been brainwashed into thinking about right and wrong, and I decided to kill my dad.
The problem is you spent your whole life thinking there are rules. There aren't.
Now, surely Malvo's understanding of evolutionary theory is demonstrably unreasonable, but nonetheless it is perfectly functional. To save time, I will summarize Malvo's philosophy. In short, his main points are: human beings are essentially apes, which implies that they are naturally prone to violent and merciless lifestyle. Modern world is replete with social norms and rules, basically lies for Malvo, which serve the purpose of domesticating and taming humans, thus making them naive and weak. Therefore, the best course of action for humans would be to stand against those externally imposed rules and social obligations that bully people into becoming worthless weaklings. In first place, let's see whether Malvo's understanding of evolution is correct or not. It is in a sense true that social norms serve the function of soothing and domesticating human beings, although we have to consider that Homo sapiens evolved a specific neurological circuitry called the social brain, which is responsible for accepting and conforming to social norms. the very social brain that is dysfunctional in Malvo's case. Second, human domestication, according to hypothesis, took place as a form of self-domestication, through which Homo sapiens developed a complex social structure based on mental faculties like empathy, cooperative communication, different forms of altruism, abstract religious ideas under which societies unite, rituals, and what's most important, the language, which allows us to create the superstructure that we know as culture. And the third, evidence for self-domestication hypothesis come from the fact that we share most of the characteristics that are associated with domesticated animals, such as reduced cranium and skull, reduced aggression, small teeth, flattened facial projection, juvenility, reduction in skeletal muscle, development of eye contact, and increased empathy. Therefore, if we conceive ourselves in terms of how we relate to our close relatives, then the prime candidate is definitely not Malvo's conceptual bloodthirsty ape, which reminds us of chimpanzees. Chimps are the most aggressive apes who engage in cold-blooded wars and violent extermination of their enemies. Rather, the appropriate parallel would be bonobos, who are the subspecies of apes. Bonobos exhibit most aspects of domestication, such as high empathy, cooperative communication, and altruism. Therefore, the essence of Homo sapiens doesn't lie into the fact that there is an ape inside us. Rather, on the contrary, we have developed the necessary social skills and neurological adaptations to control our aggressive impulses and sublimate them into socially acceptable forms. According to neuroscience, we might not possess what's known as free will, but what we do possess is the free won't, which allows us to have freedom not to consciously engage in acts that we would otherwise desire. All the mental faculties that we have developed through our social evolution become compromised when the frontal cortex gets dysfunctional, which was first exemplified by famous story of Phineas Gage, who after getting a head injury lost his sense of responsibility and necessary social skills. Now surely the fact that human beings are domesticated and social doesn't entail that we're essentially weak and uncompetitive like Lester. On the contrary, domestication hypothesis implies that the war and battle, the sort of red tide that Malvo is talking about, undergoes a qualitative transformation from merely physical into social and linguistic. Now the reason Malvo can claim that his strategy of living is successful or that it works is because it is only possible if and only if there are necessary amount of people who do conform to social norms and act in a responsible way. That allows a minority of people to exploit this situation and engage in a parasitic lifestyle. Now let's get to Malvo's rather humanitarian/philosophical justifications for his actions. Specifically Malvo's speech in the car when he drives the Market King. He states that the reason Romans killed the St. Lawrence and the reason why they were so strong is primarily because they were raised by wolves, which is an animal that Lawrence sees as worthy of respect, as he understands them to be cold-blooded, merciless predators. Now the thing is that this position is not just untrue, but the contrary is true. Remus and Romulus, the founders of Rome, were raised by none less than a shepherd, Faustulus. Now herding does symbolize sociality and domestication, as sheep are social animals. That's why Romulus is someone who was herded and therefore became civilized rather than a savage ape, thus deciding to found a civilization rather than live in the forest. Getting to the closing of the video, let's think about the relations between the main characters of the first season. Throughout the TV show, we witness an interesting psychoanthropological triangle going on between Malvo and Nygaard, creating an opposition, and culminating with Grimly, who basically serves as both a physical and psychological resolution of the major problem of the film. It is definitely not a coincidence that Grimly represents an overcoming of the very specific problem that characterizes both Malvo and Nygaard. Lester lacks the relevant mental willpower to recognize and address his traumas and insecurities. On the other hand, Grimly, who did succumb to pressure put by Malvo in the car scene when he threatened to kill him, did not let that experience to swallow his persona into the abyss of repression and resentment. Now the more noteworthy aspect of Grimly is that unlike Nygaard, he resolved his problems, not as an ape with a reactive form of aggression and irresponsibility, like Nygaard, who basically killed his wife without any premeditated thought, but rather as a social animal with a prefrontal cortex. Why? Because He engaged in a proactive aggression, giving it necessary time to solve the problem, both intellectually and physically, thus executing what's known as a delayed gratification, where you don't act instinctively based on your impulses. Therefore, it is absolutely reasonable that Grimly is the one who kills Malvo, and answers to the question as to why we see the most shades of green. Lauren tells the story about how a bear stuck his leg into a steel trap, chewing through the bone to get free and die alone in his own terms, which shows how Malvo romanticizes this solitary atomistic view of a strong animal. Now, the real story of Malvo's death repeats the story, as he himself got into a trap, injuring his leg and dragged himself to his home. However, he doesn't die in his own terms, rather he is killed by the very thing that he is so contemptuous about. The act of grimly killing Malvo is also a conceptual death, where responsibility and social apparatus overpowers the old ape mentality. Grimly represents everything that Malvo conceives to be the weak and worthless. This is a law-abiding citizen with responsibility to his daughter. However, Grimly doesn't turn out to be a conventionally weak person like Nygaard, as he doesn't allow himself to undergo a moral failure. As a result, when Grimly tells him that he has worked out the answer to his riddle, it is in one sense suggests that he recognizes that we are apes and thus responded to Malvo's challenge in his own methods. That makes us think about cases where normal people are forced to make exceptions in the moral code. In spite of the killing taking place, Grimly is not satisfied with what he did, and he definitely doesn't experience joy killing a person even though it is a serial killer like Malvo. Hence, we get an interesting picture that returns us to the starting point. Grimly's act of killing is a case of a free won't, where he goes against his humaneness, which evidenced by his absolute dissatisfaction after taking down Malvo. Therefore, we witness a conceptual evolution from Malvo's understanding of human as an ape and Grimly's new answer to the riddle, whereby human is a social animal who has the ability to do things that he might otherwise doesn't desire, but has to, not because it is pleasurable, but because it is morally right to do so. Also, he sees a wolf, another animal that he admires, which shows a type of disjunct and a conceptual barrier between the cold nature beyond his window and his current state of being, which shows his illusory, overly romanticized view of predatory. In the end, we see that Nygaard's death is also symbolically loaded, as he drowns into the freezing water, symbolizing the regression and in a way surrender to the unconscious abyss that Lester could never integrate into his psyche.